Restoring the Future, the third roundtable in the Anthropocene Transition Network series, Regenerative Strategies for the Anthropocene Transition. This series brings together 4 leading regeneration practitioners: global permaculture educator and urban agriculture pioneer Morag Gamble, regenerative culture author, educator, researcher and activist Daniel Christian Weil, regenerative urban planner, developer, educator and animateur Jason Twill, and tonight's discussion leader Chels Marshall. Before I introduce Chels, I'd like to invite you to pause with me for a moment to consider the immense privilege, opportunity and responsibility of those of us here in Australia have in sharing this vast continent with the oldest surviving culture on the planet. Indigenous Australians have cared for this land for at least 60,000 years. Some would date it at 120,000 years. They have lived through the last ice age, seen the seas rise and flood the coastal plains and river valleys in the early centuries of the Holocene. Having lived on this land sustainably for countless generations, they now face with us all the existential threats of the Anthropocene. I'd like to acknowledge their success in living sustainably, adapting to immense environmental transitions, and developing cultural traditions and land management practices finely attuned to the custodianship of this land, and surviving the ravages and ongoing deprivations of European colonialism over the last 250 years. Please join me in honouring their singular achievements and their elders past, present and to come. So now to our topic for this roundtable, Reindigenising the Future, or applying Earth-centric ecocultural values for a post-growth world. As is our practice in this series, Chels will open up tonight's roundtable conversation and then invite our other guests to take up the themes of her opening remarks. It's indeed a pleasure to invite Chels to begin tonight's discussion. Over to you.
Thanks, Ken. Sounds like you read out my whole CV.
I left out a few chapters there, Chels.
It's extensive. Look, before I go into things, I'd just like to acknowledge the Gumbaynggirr people's totem. I'm Gumbaynggirr. I'm from the north coast, east coast of Australia. And in Gumbaynggirr country, our totem is the ocean. It's the life force, and it's the spiritual force of what makes me who I am, and what makes our culture and our community what they are, with the strength and with the healing components of the ocean. I need to give respect, firstly, and also as one of our major life sources and what I like to call one of the primary organs of the planet. And so welcome everyone to tonight. I think how I'll start is I'll open with a story. It's a story that I was told when I was young, and it's all very ocean-centric, but it's like a series and part series of a story and a storyline. It's related to the Gane sisters, which are the Goanna sisters, which are the 2 women that made the sea and made the coastline. So with their Gane sticks, their digging sticks, they made the ocean. It's a fantastic story. It's way better than like a Mills and Boons. There's lots of drama in there. There's a murder. There's a mystery. There's poison. There's a little bit of sort of sexual sort of connotation, and it's just jam-packed full of all these life experience things. But essentially, it's the two sisters, that the older sister and the younger sister, that made the coastline. They also made the north and the south winds. So the stronger, bigger sister went south, which is why we get the stronger winds from the south, and the younger sister went north, which is the north wind, which are the smaller winds, and the playful winds. They're the ones that also bring in things like blue bottles and all those sort of things that come in. So a bit tricky, a bit playful, as younger sisters are. They now sit up in the sky as part of the Seven Sisters star constellation, the two last stars in the Pleiades. And they essentially sit there and remind us of the role that females have in maintaining ocean law and ceremony, and the reasons why women have integrated and integral roles in the management of our planet and the environment, and in the protection and associated responsibilities for looking after our planet, and particularly the ocean. The next part of that story, when the sea started to rise, is about the koala brothers. It's also a story about Garuja, the whale, the Dunghiagagus, the koala brothers, Balingen the quoll, and it's part of that continuing epic, second component to the making of the sea with the Gano sisters, and it's sort of associated to like a 5-part series. It's almost sort of verging on Game of Thrones type stuff as you start connecting and moving along. But this story in particular was written with my kin sister, Chels Smith, in 2019, and I think it was so summing of what I was trying to do in my PhD that I included it as my last paragraph in my PhD. So I'll give it a go. So it was the start of the story is basically from an act of violence against the sacredness of life and country, and it resulted in the two Goanna sisters making the sea. So this violence was where a man or another entity was trying to take the life of these two sisters. So the land became flooded, and the people who were far out on the ocean fishing became cut off from the homeland. They took refuge on top of a hilltop and asked the koala brothers if they could use their intestines to make a bridge back to the homeland. And if you have a look, I don't know if there's any ecologists out there, but if you have a look at the intestine of a koala, you have a look on it, and there's all these little markings that look like footprints. It's really cool. So all the people were on the bridge making their way back to the land when the mischievous Balingen, the eastern quoll. So there's a town up here called Bellingen, and that's derived from the name Balingen, the place of the quoll. So Balingen stood and was filling them with fear. So what he was doing was making the waves bigger and freaking them out and threatening to chop down the bridge. Starting to really make things hairy and frighten everyone with this changing sort of coastline and this rising sea. He continued his mischievousness by calling on the huge sea creature Garuja, the whale, the humpback whale. However, when Garuja was coming, he could see the people were afraid, and he felt their fear and reassured them that he was here to help them. And because Garuja, the humpback whale, carries in his huge heart lots of love and respect for all life, for life is sacred. He started singing, and his song went straight into the hearts of the people, so they were then filled with the same love and respect. And then the people felt strong, they felt encouraged, and continued on their way to a drastically changed Jagun, or landscape. They knew that they would need to listen to country, to hear the new songs, and to see the new dances, to see the new animals and the new landscape. They would have new responsibilities and new relationships. They would need to make new agreements to be part of that continuation in the sacredness and holiness of all life, and to then build again the law belonging to place and to peace. So this story is the Gingen Gundi Managan Binda Juangma Nyambayu. This means let's build a law belonging to peace, and let's set things right for all of us. It's a story that tells of the last sea level rise. It's a story that tells us that we have responsibilities for looking after country. It's a story that reminds us that climate change is real, and it's happened over the last 10,000 years, 15,000 years, 35,000 years, and so on. The other components of the story tell of the last sea level rise and the intensity of storms and the changes of the land and the seascape. It reminds us of and warns us of the fear and hysteria that could happen. And it tells us of the whales that started their migration up the east coast and the love and happiness that they brought with them, as they still do today. This story is a reminder, it's a warning, and a solution to the consequences of climate change and sea level rise and what we're basically doing on this planet at the moment. So it's about finding that position. Oh, hang on a minute. Hello. And we just had a little visitor. Oh. And that, yeah, we need to be able to come together and find these solutions and understand these new landscapes and understand these new processes that are about to happen. So, it's particularly pertinent in this time of uncertain times. We've got global capital, political uncertainty, environmental instability, food insecurity, profound species loss and ecosystem breakdowns. All the natural systems essential to our existence and survival, including the forests, the oceans, the rivers and the air, continue to decline and diminish. They're essentially, the planet's in need of palliative care. And so what do we do? Those factors and the unknown factors are too much to ignore or to leave to someone else to fix or deal with. We're now at the point where a mass social paradigm shift through mind framing actions are required to bring that balance back to that eco-centric thought that promote, different lifestyles and existence on these landscapes that are changing. So with that, one of those concepts is the integration of Indigenous knowledge systems. And as Ken said from the start, many Indigenous cultures throughout the world have lived on this planet sustainably for a very, very long time. And part of that sustainability came with, social constructs and law that belong to the earth, where the earth and the processes are put first and in primary position, where everything else around it, including the economy, trade, resource partitioning, allocation, all had to be Earth-centric in their processes in the first instance. It's the nexus of that paradigm, putting these natural processes first, because they're the components that sustain life, and we know that. And so in coming through that, it's like, okay, well, if we're putting things together, we're trying to understand sustainability, we're trying to understand the impacts that we have on this planet, we're trying to understand what we've got left of our resources, we're implementing all these sort of governance structures and legislations, etc. So why aren't they working? Why aren't any of these things working? Why are we still moving into these areas where we're still seeing excessive loss of trees. We're still seeing excessive loss of species. Our food resources are being reduced. The landscapes that grow our foods are becoming poor. And even Sunshine, my puppy, doesn't like it either. And so one of the key components is then, okay, let's have a look at a different toolbox. All right. Let's look at cultural paradigms or cultural ideology where everything that is in place comes through climate, landscape and the culture, and using these as the foundations. It's moving into a space where we need to utilise all systems thinking and emotional intelligence to guide us and alter our human dominated dimension of existence. It's time to move with new ideologies and tools and frameworks to find this new future, or this future by design is what I like to call it. So it involves those effective adaptation principles, the planning, to use the best available knowledge, whatever its source is. And in the face of climate change and the risks and impacts that remain uncertain and unpredictable, there is a growing need to foster this co-production of new knowledge sets, and basing those new knowledge sets upon collaborative efforts involving Indigenous-based knowledge systems. So this new future by design, what does it look like? What can be the benefits in it? So one component is by integrating traditional knowledge systems, and in particular traditional knowledge practices. So this worldview and this consciousness can help to recalibrate our future. So it's also part of succession in making the next generation more aware, more eco-centric, and with intelligence and holistic solution solving. So using these Indigenous frameworks that are, tend really to be more fluid and organic, and not focused in on narrow perspectives with the inability to adjust and adapt, which is what a lot of our social and governance constructs are like at the moment. In the end, this necessity will force innovation, and it'll force the use of new science and new technology to deliver those mechanisms that we need to make us more efficient, and to make us more adaptable. But these innovative solutions and adaptive mechanisms are all useless if only a small percentage of the population and the planet are committed or believe in the practicality of it. So when you look at these Indigenous systems, it's like, okay, what are they like? What are they? And something that comes really close is the regenerative design concept. So that comes close to those paradigms. But essentially, what it consists of is these cultural processes that are holistic in their nature. So they derive from a earth-based and an earth-centric point. They put all living systems first, and it also then includes a social construct and a law that comes with it that enables people to be able to function and to live within those boundaries of sustainability. And it's sustainability with an Indigenous ideology. So, and that also answers some of the questions. It's why Indigenous people, Aboriginal people, particularly in Australia, have been able to come through these expansive and immense timescales, whereas lots of other Indigenous civilizations and societies throughout the world fell off. And a lot of them fell off because of this dirty word called greed and capitalism, and taking too many resources and not being able to manage those resources effectively over time and space. And a lot of this came back to our social constructs, which include things like totemism, kinship, animism, and basic, creation ideology. So I think, I don't know if I've been talking on a little bit there, but it's trying to form a basis of, that redesigning, and how Indigenous paradigms and ideology can be inserted in. And one of those that I talk to people a lot about is seasonal cycles, and traditional seasonal cycles, and cultural calendars. These calendars are constructs that help us understand seasonality. So, still in Australia, being, in the position we are, we're close to the equator, so you don't get the distinct variables between the 4 seasons: summer, winter, autumn, spring. So there's these other components within, and I believe that the knowledge of those seasonal cycles, and living and operating to those seasonal cycles, are part of why we were able to be sustainable and to endure and have resilience through these changes. It was complete knowledge and understanding of all the biological functions within plants and the animals that relied on those plants, complete understanding and knowledge on the weather systems and the weather patterns and everything that's within those ecological and biological system cycles. And it was through those constructs that it then ordered and guided, all the social components that we live by, the movement, the eating during times when animals are supposed to be eaten and in season. And when you do then start taking animals, you're not taking them during breeding season, and when the environmental conditions are not conducive to their existence. So it's understanding those interactions between the spheres of Earth's functional systems. And I might hand over to Morag if she's on. Is she on?
Yes.
Yeah, because one of the fundamentals within that was understanding and having knowledge on plants, and plants as the primary component of food, habitat, shelter for everything else, and then obviously the oxygen and maintaining water cycles and clean water and food cycles and food processes. And unfortunately, I missed the talk we had the other week on the agriculture stuff, but it's I think Morag will be able to follow on here of where that system of understanding plants is central to understanding how we live on this planet. It's our food, it's our oxygen, it's the shelter, and it's part of the clean water systems. Big fan of plants.
Thanks, Chels. And I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on where I'm speaking with you today, the Gubbi Gubbi people, and pay respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And hello to everyone. It's kind of a bit weird for us here because we're talking to each other as a group of 5, and I know there's other people out there. So hi and welcome to the session. Thanks, Chels. Whenever I hear you speak, I feel like an absolute infant because I'm a first generation born Australian. My mum came here when she was young. On my dad's side, I'm a second generation. And so my knowledge and connection to this land and to the systems is so new. And I feel like I'm, only just beginning to sort of touch on the beginnings of this deep thread of knowledge. We were just talking before we opened up the session today. Chels, I think you were saying 120,000 years of continuous cultural emergence of here in Australia. Enormous, you know, beyond our even capacity to understand the depth of that. And so as a permaculture practitioner, one of the things that we focus on is that, and I feel that it connects really well with what you're saying, because the basis of permaculture is earth care. That's everything about what we do. Earth care, people care, fair share, but earth care is the foundation of it. And actually quite often people think that permaculture is an approach that is about growing food, and that's the foundation. Actually, the key part of permaculture is trying to find ways to meet our needs within the system with as least space and as least impact as possible, so that there's far more space for rewilding, regeneration of landscapes, and how we actually design and integrate our own human presence in the landscape is a regenerative one too. And I was just spending a bit of time wandering up through our valley today, just behind my place, and reflecting on this sense of connection. I've only been here for 20 years within Crystal Waters, and even in that time, though, something about our way to slow down, observe, connect deeply in place starts to give us a sense of these relationships and how they form and how it might feel to actually have such a deep connection to place. And it's something about that, the proximity, the slowing down, the being connected to land, to community, and to the species around. You know, for example, you know, I kind of feel like here within this eco-village, the people are just one of the dwellers in the landscape. And, you know, for example, the way in which it's been designed means that there's no fences between people's places. So the kangaroo pathways continue. And I was actually following a kangaroo path today as I wandered my way up to the ridge through these regenerating forests. And I met up with a couple of kangaroos who were pelting their way down the hill, and they're kind of like sliding off down the hill. I always got completely bowled over, but I follow the kangaroo pathways, and I made some big mistakes when I was early on. I was trying to do the right thing by regenerating the landscape, doing a lot of, you know, tree planting of local Indigenous species, and I just completely put them in the wrong spot. I put them in a place where it was actually a kangaroo pathway, and, you know, 90% of them got completely trounced. And so I had to start to rethink how I was being in this place, and how that being just one of the dwellers in the landscape, that the way in which I planted, the way in which I was trying to do the regeneration had to be in sort of in cooperation with all the species that are here, and really start to recognize that kind of the well-being of the land and the ecosystems and other species is really completely intertwined with our own. And so, you know, looking after the whole. Some of the things, you know, that I've started to notice are, you know, for example, today, it was about 10:30, and there was this great cacophony of kookaburra sounds, just absolutely going off. And so what I've learnt through the stories of this place is that if you hear that, it's not just one kookaburra or two kookaburras, it's like a whole flock of kookaburras just making that sound, that it's going to rain soon. And so I always second guess myself. So I did a bit of a check on the weather search, and lo and behold, you know, showers are due in the next hour. and then there's also the rainbirds that come through. And because I'm really, the way that I've tried to design the edible landscape in and around here is to not be just setting up an irrigation system and, you know, it's not like Mr. McGregor's garden. It's this food forest, and that it's really trying to be based on the type of natural rainfall patterns and the, you know, working with the cycles that are here and learning those. And so I've become really quite aware that the signals for the rain coming give me a great sense of joy and relief. And there's certain smells that you start to notice. And when you start to slow down and connect with the land, like I'm saying this as a complete newbie because, you know, like I said, I've been our family's been on this country for 70 years. But I'm starting to notice things that make me feel that if we create a lifestyle that gives us a chance to slow down enough to notice and to be actually reliant on our landscape around us for food, for building materials, for water, and that noticing how much the care of the land is also intertwined with the care of community and care of the regeneration of the whole system. We do things very differently. You know, I think I might have mentioned last time, even just that idea that when we relocalize the way in which we live, like every piece of water comes out of our house goes back into the landscape. So what we do with that water in the meantime, we take care of it. We, you know, that care is embedded in the way in which we live, because the direct impact is there. So this coming closer to home, coming closer to the impact, understanding, you know, the direct relationship between the food system around us and our lives and the lives of the wildlife and other species is it changes the way in which you live. And I think that kind of comes a little bit towards finding ways to as you're saying, re-indigenize, because I don't feel a sense of connection to where I've come from, my family, but I do feel a deep sense of joy and deep sense of connection where I am now. And so trying to find my way into that place and ask as many questions and be open to know that I'm an absolute infant in this space, that every day I learn something new, and I try and walk as many times through the landscape with local elders to share the knowledge of the place and to share the stories of what to harvest. And one of the things that I really loved last time I went walking about was to say, you know, look at the plant. You don't just harvest whatever you feel like. You actually look and, you know, ask the plant, you know, which bit can I harvest? Which bit is going to be something that is going to be useful for me, but also not harming the plant. And so there's a relationship. And I think this bringing together the people, nature, and food systems together in this kind of permaculture eco-village way is possibly one of the most sound, regenerative approaches to living lightly on the planet, so that we have a chance to regenerate. And it feels great. Like I feel a sense of joy every time I enter into the landscape, but I also feel a sense of pain when something goes wrong. And I think there's something in that it hurts when you notice something going wrong. For example, the other place that I have a deep connection with is the Gippsland Lakes, and my family has this a long history there too. And I've noticed, like, I'm 51, so I've been going there for my entire life, and I've noticed over the years how there's this shifting and changing in the lakes from seaweed to ocean weed. From the jellyfish type are changing, the fish have diminished, the black swans have gone, the koalas habitat is disappearing, and this change that's happening over time that you feel so much pain as a result of that. And knowing that it's directly related to an economic decision about opening up the channel into the lakes so that the fishery boats can get in and out far more easily and harvest more fish. Completely economic decision, and the ripple effects of that. So just coming back to that point, I think, and I'll finish there, is just about slowing down enough to feel like a human scale, an ecological scale way of life that gives us a chance to deeply connect and see and know and see the connections that are around us, and to, you know, the thing that I love, one of the most things that I love about this place is watching the birth of clouds. And I don't know if that's a name of this place, but I watch every day as clouds kind of get born off the hills just below here. Like I watch them just come up in the morning, they just go poof, and then they just kind of float up. You can see the shape of them. And every day, and there must be a name for that. I'm sure it's not, you know, Conondale. That There's a name, and I would love to know what it is. Yeah. So that sense of having an earth-centric life and feeling that the well-being of us is deeply connected with the well-being of the ecosystems, and designing our way of life to meet that. And that's kind of where the permaculture design, regenerative design, and being, you know, fully informed by Indigenous cultures and traditional practices, I think is, you know, I've been living this for as long as I can remember, and it feels right. And I don't know how else to explain it. And I would love to invite as many people to, you know, to come and explore, come and visit and see what it's, maybe something different, maybe it's something in between. I'm not sure who'd like to pick up from that.
I have a question for you, Chels, because I sense that you carry an experience of building a bridge that is now such an important bridge to build, but probably also an experience of all the trauma and dysfunctionality of one of the cultures that are trying to meet here. And I'm speaking to bridging into, as a systems ecologist, bridging into the world of science and data analysis and understanding within Western scientific frameworks, ecosystems dynamics. And then, okay, now people say we need to pay more attention to Indigenous knowledge, but my sense is, and I would want to check that with you, that too often you're brought in as the token Indigenous ecologist in the room, and then you might not even be given the place to speak first, although your people have been there for so long. And how do we truly bring together, in a sense of both valuing contributions from both sides, in a way that, because right now there's also this tendency to shut up everybody white completely forever because they've just messed it up, and there's this sense of, well, you should just be in the outer circle and listen for a very long time. Where do you sit with that? Because you also in your opening remarks, you were saying we need to find finding a new future by design, and then you said this will force us to use new sciences and new technologies. And I just wanted to check with you, when you use the word technology there, is it in the sense of technology that most Westernized listeners would understand it, or do you refer to all the things that you were also speaking about as technologies of the sacred that your people have been developing over 40,000 years, which are possibly more powerful to live healthily in place than any kind of SpaceX rocket taking another satellite out into space? So just passing ball back to you to tell us a little bit more about those nuances of making these worlds meet.
Yeah, I think because of past practices, you know, in Australia especially, what you essentially had was, you know, another country with their own social constructs and ideologies, you know, essentially forcing their way into, you know, Indigenous people's country and dressing it up as being terra nullius, no one's home, lights are out, nothing going on here. Are backwards and, you know, dumb people that have, you know, no intelligence, etc. That's what Australia was dressed up and sold to Britain as, and, you know, it was essentially all part of that construct of, you know, taking over someone's country. And, you know, it still happens today. It's just part of that overall strategy. But, you know, I think we're at a point where, you know, there is realization now that, you know, it wasn't like that at all. You know, the technologies that existed in Australia, you know, we had people within, you know, Aboriginal clans that were doctors, you know, they were medicine people. We had people in there that were scientists, people that, you know, were alchemists and mixed potions together from plants and you know, remedies to make, you know, medicines or, you know, poisons and etc. You had your chemists in there that were able to extract highly toxic chemicals out of seeds and plant species to make them edible. You had farmers in there. You had people that farmed extensive parts of country, whether it was through fire stick farming or whether it was direct farming. Yams and yam farms are a perfect example of that. Your kangaroo grasses and your eel farms in Victoria. Those sort of technologies were existing in Australia prior to any colonisation, and those systems and those technologies all revolved around this eco or earth-centric cultural construct that put the environment and those biological, ecological and natural systems first as the primacy in how you then generate your law, your customs, your beliefs, your technologies, your living arrangements, your social construct, intermarriage, and how many which resource capability and land capability, resource partitioning, and then it just spirals on and on from there. And in Australia, over the last 2 centuries, the value and the application of Aboriginal ecological knowledge has been accepted, and some of it's been also fused into Western lifestyles, without too much controversy. So one of the issues is when that holisticness of Aboriginal knowledge is deconstructed and it's not taken as a holistic component. So, for instance, things like medicines, have been isolated into separate knowledge, and that medicinal component of native plants. We've got antiseptics from eucalyptus, tea tree, lemon myrtle, the manuka honeys or the honeys that are in callistemon species, or in the case of what's starting to happen now is the application of fire in the landscape for ecosystem management and species management, and to then also reduce some of those fears and risks with high fuel loads. And people are now starting to understand and recognise cultural burning practices in managing those landscape dynamics. But one component is what I'm saying is that there still tends to be a culture of deconstructing, and so taking out those bits and pieces that we as Western white folk think are more applicable and usable and of value to us. So what you're essentially doing is deconstructing that whole cultural system and that whole paradigm of everything holisticness, and a future by design or a new future basically needs to have all those things as integrated components into it. So that includes looking at the spirituality, starting to see the landscape and the rivers and the mountains as living entities, which we're now starting to see, where people are now dedicating rivers and mountains and their whole shires as living entities with the same rights as people. So it's all that component, taking up the knowledge, as I said earlier, that knowledge. One of the things that I see that could be integrated into Australia, and there was a question that came up as well, how do we start bridging within a multicultural society and bringing the whole culturally diverse population in. One of those, as I mentioned, is the use of seasonal calendars and acknowledging traditional seasonal cycles. We don't have 4 seasons in Australia. If you've been in Australia for longer than 10 years, or even 5, or even 20, you'd understand that there's not 4 seasons in Australia. we've got at least 6 to 7, and that's in line with traditional seasonal cycles. And it's that acknowledgement and understanding those seasonal cycles that then helps us to understand the plants, the animals, going surfing or going swimming during shark time or shark season. You can avoid those sort of disasters. Then it relates to fire management as well. Eating fish species that are in season and not being shipped and exported and imported from other places. So with what Morag was saying, you're eating more at that bioregional level and to seasonal consumption basically. And then you're looking at this resilience and adaptation. If you understand, our seasonal changes and our seasonal cycles, it helps you become a bit more resilient. So you know that there's going to be a period, after December that's really intensely hot and humid, but then it's that brings on that monsoonal event and those monsoonal pressure systems from out of the Coral Sea and out of that area, and they influence then our weather patterns in Australia. So that then helps us to go, okay, well, we only have to put up with this for 3 weeks, and then we get intense downpour. And then the little periods in between spring and summer, which is dry, and and where animals are just starting to rejuvenate, and seeds and everything is starting to fall. So and primarily species diversity is starting to flourish and function, and your insects are in there doing what they do. It's definitely a time to just let those cycles do their thing, and then understanding that it's these sort of things that help us become adaptable and resilient in the future. Because once we're getting tuned to the fact that we don't have 4 seasons, that we have 6 to 7, it helps us to understand climate change and changes in these regional, national and localized weather systems and weather patterns. So that's one thing that we can start looking at in bridging and bringing those worlds together and understanding a bit more. And there's a whole suite, but as I said, it involves taking on that holisticness of everything and not just picking apart and pulling out what you want to. And that's probably one of the biggest things, Daniel, that as an ecologist that I deal with. And I was saying earlier that even looking at separating Aboriginal culture from things like biodiversity.
G'day, Jinda.
Gagu. So I'll give you an introduction to Jason. Jason's, when I was writing my PhD, I got into a really depressive mode. I was at a point where it was like, everything's, stuffed, and, what's the use of it? And, capitalism and, these multinationals are going to rule the world and dictate how we live into the next 10, 20 years. And then I met Jason. And Jason opened up my eyes to this whole system of urban design and regenerative urban design. And I started working with Jason, and where it's another area where we started to look at laying Indigenous fundamentals and those paradigms as a base foundation to then building urban scapes. So I'm not sure whether that's what you were going to talk about, but that was the intro that I gave you.
I'll talk about that next week. But,
okay. Stay tuned to it because it'll be cool.
Yeah. So I'm acknowledging that I'm calling in from Gadigal land. I'm recognizing their elders past and present, the Eora Nation. And then the Bugga people and Gambanger Nation, who've kind of adopted me, Chels. And I have a huge bit of gratitude to Chels because she's given me the best gift of my life of the friendship, family, love, opening up her heart and home to me. and sharing the knowledge she's sharing with you tonight, which has been pretty prolific. And I'll give a little bit of insight about my journey as a non-Indigenous person, and why I gravitated towards Chels and how we started working together. But I'm from the East Coast in the U.S., and I was born on colonized land. I was raised in a colonized Western education system. We were taught, cowboys and Indians, it's something in the past. Very little of anything about contemporary First Peoples in the Americas. A little blurb here and there in museums we'd visit. And it wasn't until in New York, I was on East 8th Street in the Village, and I'll share this maybe next week as well. And I saw that, that T-shirt of Chief Seattle, and that phrase, we don't belong to the earth, we belong to the earth does not belong to us. And that just simple phrase that we belong to the earth created a little crack in my mind. And I was probably 14 or 15 at the time. And, my life journey has been about continuing to crack my mind and decolonize my mind, or cultivate a new way of thinking. In New York, it was really hard to get that connection. What I learned about First Peoples is they have the stereotype of not being afraid of heights. So a lot of them were the steel workers in New York City that were not afraid to be up on 50, 60 stories up in the air on a beam of steel. Little else was learned in that regard from my perspective. And when I moved to Seattle, it was a bit more. There was naming, place naming. There was different acknowledgement to First Peoples there. Nothing like I've learned in acknowledging country here in Australia. Worked with some different tribes in the Northwest, much more connected. And then I came across this work that was happening in Santa Fe, at the Santa Fe Institute on the language of spirituality. And it was basically a gathering of Indigenous elders with Western scientists and linguistics, and looking at reconciling the kind of scientific Western analytical way of explaining the world and the storytelling and lore that you heard Chels open up with today. And the customs and traditions and ontology and epistemology friction between the two, it wasn't letting the scientists understand, how the Western scientists had wronged them even in the conversations that were happening. And there's a really good paper on that by a woman named Zimmerman. It really helped, it cracked my mind open quite a bit about the source of where my knowledge came from, traditions I grew up in my family, the values that were instilled in me. Unlike what I've learned from my Maori brothers and sisters, when they're born, their placenta is buried in the earth where they're from, having that country-centered, anchor in them. I've never felt home. I've moved like 15 times in my life. So I've just had to kind of cultivate my own mind that the earth is my home wherever I am, and the people around me are my family. Then when I came to Australia, it was the first time I started hearing people acknowledge country. And I was like, oh, that's great. And then my wife knows how much I chase this knowledge and read books about it, study it, and to help me reprogram my mind and my way of seeing the world. And I went and saw Chels give a lecture at the Australian Museum because my wife sent me this link. She's like, oh, you'll love this. This is right up your alley. And even before the lecture, I emailed Chels, introduced myself, like, I'm coming to see you. I want to meet you. Like I was stalked. She calls me her stalker. But what she said resonated with me into my core, right? And I could say in the 4 years I've been working with Chels, I've learned more than I have in the previous 25 years I've been studying this topic. Completely, sorry, I cried. It's such a huge gift. And I take it with so much respect that I'm, custodian of this knowledge. And my responsibility of how I carry that forward to my kids. Sorry, I'm a very sensitive dude. And how important it is that this knowledge really shape Western society. And there's a question in there, how do you reconcile this knowledge? And it's not just leaning on First Peoples and just continuing to ask questions is one thing that Chels is really gracious with their time, but it's like a 12-step program. You have to every day reprogram your mind the morning you wake up. And so I always have to reprogram my mind, put my feet on the ground, and I say, I belong to the earth and I'm in service to life. And just that quick statement centers me every morning about who I am, what I'm doing with my life, how I interact with people around me. But I've had to spend a lot of time with other non-Indigenous people, reading a book called Decolonizing Solidarity, understanding how a lot of non-Indigenous people come into this place and want to provide a service or support this movement, and have set it back because they didn't understand how to operate within that world. So we've had to teach ourselves in work groups, how can I be more in service to Indigenous causes in Australia, where I'm from? How do I open doors? How do I make sure that we're acknowledging deeper, we're going more authentically in that space? And the work we do, a lot of this is opening up a door and putting, Chels is in the room and Chels does what she does. And we're sitting around a room of developers, builders, architects, engineers, and you can see the magic of how their entire mental model around starting a project completely shifts. And they approach it from a very different perspective, and how they look at the land, how they look at culture, how they look at the deep history of that place, and how to respect that before they put a pencil to paper. And that's been a huge shift in some of the work we've been doing in Australia. And there's also another really huge dimension to this, I think, is language. And I know my sister Lucy's on the phone, and she's also been an incredible mentor to me, and really teaching me Maori ideology and spirituality. But there's so many different language groups within Australia. As one in New Zealand, I see that's a really powerful mechanism shifting Western minds and understanding that words and language have very different meaning. And a mountain means 5 different things, and relationality totemically to those rivers, to that mountain, to that sky, is imbued in that language. And we're raised in a language that separates us from that. I think it was Bill Reed who gave me the book Tending the Wild, and it was the first time I really understood the nature wasn't really in the lexicon of First Nations Americans. And that, to be separate from is something completely outside of that mindset. But it's a daily reprieve of really changing and reprogramming your mind. And it's not easy. I think we just had a session with Tyson Yakapura last week, and I told him about my 12-step life. I'm 20 years sober. And there's a lot of correlation between when you pivot your life and change your direction, where you're going to go. And it's a daily mental model shift around that. And he created the Anthroholics Anonymous 12-step program for reindigenating your mind. And it is like that. Yes, you can read a bunch of books. Yes, you can go to lectures, but it's a daily practice. And, I'm really grateful that my children have grown up with Chels around them, and Chels' daughter, Lacey, and her brother, and going up on her ancestral home in Balanoa to really walk in the woods and learn the plants, learn the species. What are the medicinal plants? Something I never had as a kid, right? And how do we get that knowledge into our schools? What's my responsibility knowing that knowledge, that when I go to my kids' school and they're offering Spanish, Italian, French, and Chinese, why aren't you teaching them Gadigal? That's a language that's still living right here on the land that they're learning on. Why aren't you teaching that? And they're not. So it's a lot of, the responsibility we have with this knowledge is really important. And how do we engage? And the conversation I had with David McConville this morning, some of you guys might know, is a brilliant thinker. And we basically come to the conclusion that we're not going to solve any of these issues ecologically or socially until we decolonize the world. And it starts with decolonizing our minds. And that's an individual responsibility that we take on ourselves to do. With the gift of knowing that First Nations living culture all around the world is a living body of knowledge that has a lot of solutions to driving this pathway to planetary health and saving humanity from itself. I'll stop there.
Just wanted to briefly come in on this notion of re-indigenization, because it's one of those words that when you use it as a Western white, overeducated, overprivileged guy, you're almost certainly going to get a bunch of backlash from people who then start lecturing on whatever project it takes place in that moment. But you chose, Chels, you chose that as part of the title for this session. And I would love to hear your perspective on what is a process of re-indigenization, and as disconnected, culturally colonized like all our minds have been colonized by the story of neoliberal economics and so on and so forth. Do we white people have the possibility of redemption in the process of re-indigenization? And is it like, because from my perspective, we're all like, if we begin to learn the wisdom that you shared at the beginning, that we too are the children and in the lineage of ancestors that are Sky Father and the sea and the ocean and every living being has the mountains, the rivers, are our ancestors too. The question is, how do we live in right relationship to these ancestors again, in place, with deep connection to the story of place and whatever is still there of the ancestral history that some people have guarded. How do you see this process of re-indigenization, and are there any invitations in terms of how to be a humble apprentice and pilgrim on that path to people who do care to make that bridge, even if they may be on the side of the perpetrators historically?
Side of perpetrators, like that. Look, that's a big long question. I think you had about 20 questions within one question, Daniel. Look, I think one of the key components is obviously that acknowledgement, and one of the components of that is, I think, what we're all getting wrapped up in is that, everywhere on every continent, Western society is still colonizing, and it's just like, okay, how about we stop the colonizing and accept that we've colonized, or these places have been colonized to their max capacity. Are you guys getting that buzz? Yeah. All right, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm just getting a buzz. I got struck by lightning once, and it just comes back on me. I just don't know when it's going to happen. And it's that approach and that ideology of just, let's just keep colonizing and colonize, and hey, let's formulate some plants to start colonizing Mars while we're colonizing Earth. And it's like, okay, well, how about we just stop the colonizing? We've colonized to our max capacity. Let's start looking at where we start now designing how we live in harmony. And part of that is seeing yourself as part of these ecological, biological, astronomical cycles, that you are part of it. You're not separated from it. We are a living entity. We are a living system within these living cycles. What's my place? Do I put myself in this human-centric position as being above and beyond all of it? And then I just treat it, as I wish, with no respect and no, thought to the future and the ramification of my actions? Or do I see myself as an integral part of these biological and ecological systems that are happening around me? Because they essentially are the things that will make me who I am while I'm in this place and this landscape. They will dictate my moods. They will dictate where I go. They will dictate the food that I eat. So the first thing is respecting and acknowledging that. And, that's one of the key components of an indigenized paradigm.
I see a question about incorporating this stuff into our work, maybe more practically, how we're looking at Indigenous urbanism on some projects. I'll use one of the example projects we've worked on, Chels, where it starts with that cultural assessment, ecological assessment of place, right? And Chels very graciously making connection with the local custodians wherever we're working, so they have a voice and a say in what happens and how it's shaped. And that's usually a dialogue we have between the developer and them. First is cracking open the mindset of the developer group so that they understand this stuff, and it's kind of a tag team effort to kind of really frame it. The design team usually is ambitious and wants to jump in, and bringing the kind of regenerative Indigenous model into that dialogue, it gives them a nice framework to work within. And a really powerful tool, which Chels talked about, is the ecological calendar, right? Knowing that we've mapped out these species that are known to be from this land that we're looking at redeveloping or creating something from. These are the main thriving things. These are ones that are threatened. So there's going to be a responsibility in the infrastructure we put in and whatever we put in, housing or buildings, that respect that and regenerate that species or flora or fauna. So it gives basically a framework for the design team to work within that respects what's working for life in that land, was the first question we asked. But importantly then, how it interprets into the architecture, the vernacular of architecture that tells the story of that land and creates that uniqueness of place that's missing from our industry completely. I walk around any city, anywhere in the world, and I can't really tell where I am. If you take away the Opera House and the Harbor Bridge, the same skyline everywhere else. So we're missing that. And that's what frustrates me about Australia. You have like 120,000 years of knowledge and stories and expression of culture and place to draw from to express that architecture, which I don't see. And it's tokenistic, and it comes through in arts here and there. It's 1% of the budget here. But there's such a powerful medium to draw from to shape that architectural vernacular that makes this place so distinctive and makes the world want to see it. And it tells the story of what the values of this country are about and recognizing that culture. But importantly, the most important, I think, is the governance. All right, so how do you instill that totemic relationship into a new community? How do you get those living systems of flora and fauna into the school and teach the children that they have a responsibility and a connection to the, what's it, Latham snipe or the golden sun moth?
Golden sun moth, yeah.
Sun moth is a good one. And how does that, place naming, right? We talked about this, I think, in a previous session. How do you get people to call their home associated with their watershed? We talked about that with bioregionalism. Like what watershed are you from? How do you connect people to the living system that they're sitting within? Because we disassociate ourselves with it so much. We name our streets after colonists, we acknowledge white heroes from the past. It's very different in New Zealand. It still has a long way to go, but it's more progressed in that manner. But that governance piece is huge. How do you inculcate this in the culture of a place? And all that stuff I've talked about before creates that foundation for that culture to arise from that place. But then how it's governed, how people communicate, how people understand they have a responsibility of custodianship to what's around them. And it's a long human story ahead of us, but this is the journey and pathway we have to go on. And how it changes the way we teach our children in the home and in the school is a huge one we talked about last time. You want to add to that, Chels?
Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. Just it was an interesting process, and this was the sort of stuff that came at the end of my research and study, and it was like, yeah, it was such an eye opener. It was like, yeah, look, this sort of technology, Daniel, can be used, in also urban design and regenerative restructure of demised or destroyed places as part of that whole reconstruction, and then starting with a new slate, applying some of these ideologies of place meaning. I showed Jason a map of Gumbaynggirr country, and there's no roads on it, there's no nothing, no lines or no boundaries. That it's a Gumbaynggirr landscape, and every town or every primary location has its traditional meaning and its traditional component. And these names, if you imagine over 120, 80,000 years, that knowledge of, you know, meaning of place, you know, it's got substance to it, you know. So in one place we have, you know, the place of rocks, and yeah, you know, it's a rocky place. The place of, you know, the dolphins, and that's where the dolphins sort of rest, and you know, the resting side of, you know, the golden kangaroo, where the kangaroo lays, and you know, so all these names, you know, were given to the landscape, because it was knowledge about the landscape. And as Jason said, you know, part of this continual colonizing is, you know, taking away the essence of that area and of that place, and renaming it with something that means absolutely nothing and has no meaning to it whatsoever. So, you know, I saw a question come up about, you know, how can we integrate these into, you know, our current systems and our future design. You know, that's another way of doing it, giving that recognition back to place, and giving that knowledge that's attached to it, you know, back to country, and you know, including the people that hold that knowledge and are part of that DNA within that landscape, a platform and a place to participate, and a place to, you know, be part of the conversation, and to be part of sculpting, you know, that new future, and you know, that new social construct, and you know, being part of, you know, contributing to, you know, the solutions to our problems and the direction, you know, of our systems and our landscape.
Chels, unfortunately we're sliding out of time. This is such a rich conversation. It could go on for another hour. Could you have a look at the questions in the Q&A and
Yep.
see whether there's any you can pick up and respond to in the last 10 minutes or so?
Yeah, look, I'll start with the bottom one. Look, my PhD is being edited at the moment into a book. So hopefully that will be out fairly soon. When I can apply the time, I'll do the edits required. But there's also a few papers that have come out of my PhD, and one of them will be available or online fairly soon. And I think it's in the form of a book as well, the second chapter, and I think that's being published in Switzerland. So there's lots of, and then the next question is, what's the paper about the scientific? There's lots of papers out at the moment. You know, in the last 20 years, when traditional ecological knowledge and Indigenous knowledge systems, you know, started to be recognised and come to the forefront. You know, there's lots of papers out there now, and a lot more Indigenous people writing these papers, which is really good. So it's coming from first-hand experience, and it's, you know, part of that decolonizing methodology of, you know, giving that direct information. And then there's another one here about how do we integrate the settlers. I think we've sort of covered some of that with some of the areas, and we don't have time tonight to go fully into the full suite. But over the next series, I'm sure we will. And then there's one here that said to, hey, hi Chels, from Matt, are you seeing any of the living rivers or mountains being recognised anywhere in Australia? As a matter of fact, Jason, you might have to help me out on this one. So my mind's starting to go a bit mush. I believe the Blue Mountains, I don't think that's a secret, is it? I thought that was in like a newspaper article. Yeah. You guys can't hear me, can you?
No, we can hear you fine.
Oh, okay.
I had to move the dialogue boxes out of the way. I was trying to.
Oh.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of hot zones across the country. So there is a group that we started that's part of the Commonwealth initiative that Daniel's part of with me around basically regenerating the planet, you know, reversing global warming through the Commonwealth nations. And importantly, that group is 98% women and being led by Indigenous leaders like Chels. as it should be. And there's a place in the Kimberleys that Dr. Annie Paulina is working on. So Ken introduced me to Anne. Thank you, Ken. Morags, that stuff in Queensland. There's some really incredible hot zones that are Aboriginal communities in Queensland, Victoria, WA, New South Wales. Blue Mountains is one hot zone because it's a really important area of the country, but also the council there is it's more government led. And our colleague Louise Crabtree is working with Michelle Maloney and Chels on a pretty powerful platform there. But you got to go where the energy is right now. I think the bushfires created, let's say, a national crack, an opening. COVID-19 allowed that crack to digest in our minds over the last 3 months. And I think there's a strong impetus that we rebound out of this situation in a different direction. And it's making sure that we're making these connections and recognizing the role that Indigenous leaders like Chels and the knowledge that they have of place and country can start to shape the direction of a community and the direction of a bioregion. So there's some great work to happen over the next several months. I can see it. It's like there's huge potential happening, which is great. It's hopeful.
Yeah, look, it's happening in many realms. It's also happening in the marine science realm as well, and the biomarine science realm. It's starting to slowly infiltrate into a lot of government systems as well. We've still got a long way to go, but those cracks in the filtering is starting to happen, and it's unfortunate that it takes immense natural disasters and the death of people and animals and life for people to start to understand that there is another way, there is another knowledge system, there are other tools that we can use in our toolbox for sustainability. And I'm just hoping that in the future, as we start to rebuild, and that we start to realize that we're hopeless and we're useless without those ecological functions that we're part of and that operate around us and with us. And if we keep separating ourselves from those systems, we're basically setting ourselves up for dire consequences. And we're already seeing ramifications of that sort of ideology now. And if we can draw upon Indigenous peoples' knowledge and systems to help us understand and to function and adapt in that, well, what's wrong with that? What's the problem with that, really?
Can I ask a very practical question, Chels? So you've spent a lot of time exploring and documenting those seasonal calendars in your area. So, for example, if someone's from another part of Australia, how do they connect up with those? So, say, for example, I'm thinking, people are really looking at, regenerating their agricultural systems and rethinking the whole. Like, where do they begin to do this? How can they connect?
Good question. I think it depends on where you are and what that landscape and environment's like. And a good place to start is obviously to scope out and source out local knowledge holders and maybe if there's any sort of universities or anything that has a cultural education unit attached to it, Aboriginal language centres. There's lots of these organisations that have knowledge or can facilitate and point in the right direction. I think the most important thing is coming in sort of knowing that you might not get the answer in some places, and Aboriginal people are still still very aware and alert but not alarmed about people coming in and wanting to sort of have knowledge, etc. But I think we're at that point in time where if we don't start moving in this direction of a future by design that incorporates Aboriginal people and our knowledge and our systems and us for a start, it's going to be this big white car driving off the cliff.
Very, just one brief thing to tie a beautiful loop to this wonderful conversation that I learned so much in. You started off by saying that you people's totem is the ocean, and I sense that one of the big connectors of us, of life, is that we're walking water, and that we deeply depend on oceans, particularly in the face of climate change. I think we're paying too much attention to the carbon myopia, and not enough attention to how critical the ocean ecosystems are to regulating all those larger cycles people are aware of. Can you speak a little bit to the importance of the oceans to sort of tie this all beautifully together?
All right, and we'll wrap it up in this. But you're absolutely correct, Daniel. And it's surprising that a lot of people still think that all our oxygen comes out of the Amazon rainforest and from trees. Not many people are familiar with the oxygen carbon exchange that happens within the ocean, and how important those ocean systems are for all of our climate and all the weather patterns throughout the whole globe. And it's essentially that one medium that joins all of us together. It's the one thing that connects us all. And we have our oceans suffering as well. We've got species that are being lost. We've got some of the ecological cycles starting to get out of whack, and they're key indicators that something's wrong. Key indicators. And that appreciation of this organ, this living organ, I call it like the heart, the lung, and the soul, that keeps this planet alive. It's the one thing that's conducive to all life on this planet, and it does deserve a place and recognition that it's part of that. It's that one system's function that is going to affect how we live into the future.
We close with a call to action. I'll give you the UN stuff, but we also did a lot of engagement with, well, if you're in Australia, some of the things that kind of guide industry, like Green Star, right? That a lot of decision making is from. We were engaged by the Bring Your Building Council, and what started as an innovation credit on how you how do you look at Indigenous knowledge on architecture and planning new communities. And we wrote it, all the things we're talking about on this call, but we also said it shouldn't be an innovation credit, it should be a prerequisite. And in fact, the whole Green Star system should be rethought to be aligned with the UN Declaration for Rights of Indigenous People. So we are a signatory of that declaration, and I learned that from Chels. So that's something that as advocates, all of us have a responsibility to support. Because a lot of what we're talking about is sacred land. That means something very different to you, that most of us don't see that, but to the local people from that place, it's sacred land. And every time, you're posting it every week. I see you posting like they're opening up a mine on someone's sacred land. They're destroying the reef system that's sacred, ocean area. Like, that's a really important issue that doesn't get framed in that UN declaration lens enough in this country.
Yeah.
Well, that's a very good point to finish on, I think, Jason. And we've just had the appalling demonstration of Rio Tinto blowing up a very significant sacred site in the Pilbara, and it's a site that's 46,000 years old. It contains evidence of habitation during the Ice Age, and it just got in the way of the expansion of a mine. So Rio Tinto just blew it up. And what appalls me about this is that this is not only the most extraordinary disregard of Indigenous rights and Indigenous culture, it's an offence against the whole of humanity. These sites are the heritage of all human beings. It's like a mining company saying we're going to blow up the famous cave paintings at Lascaux in France because we want to build a mine there. We'll ask the local villagers if they agree, and then we'll blow it up. So I think we all have to start to stand up for Indigenous traditions, Indigenous rights, because it's part of the sacred heritage of the whole of humanity. So anyway, that's a little note to finish on. Can I thank particularly Chels? Chels came on saying, I'm very unprepared. I thought, wow, I'd hate to see a session where Chels was prepared. We'd be here all night, I think. In fact, I'd love to see a session where Chels was fully prepared. And so thank you so much. It's been a rich and stimulating discussion. And thank you to you, Daniel, Jason, and Morag for your, as always, very insightful contributions to this discussion tonight. So next time, the next roundtable, the last in the series, will be led by Jason, and it'll be on regenerative urban design and development and planning. And in some ways, I think that session will draw together a lot of the threads that we have been exploring in these 4 roundtables. So thank you, everyone. Thank you to the participants, and stay safe and stay well.
Thank you, Ken.
Good night.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Ken.
Chels.
Thanks, Chels.
Questions tonight,
Thanks,
everyone.
Jason and Daniel.
Chels, thanks for everyone for your contributions. Always good to learn from you. See you.
Bye-bye.
Good night.
Yada,
Martha
yada,
Keller Halls, you're absolutely correct.
Yada, yada.
Yeah, Yangagu.
ah